Hello. In this next series of lectures, we're going to be talking about the Muslim empires. So our objectives in these next few lectures is to see how Islamic civilizations differed depending on the historical context in which Muslims lived. There's a tendency sometimes for people to say like, oh, Islam is this, Islam is that. As a historian and someone who specializes in religious history, I want to emphasize that there is diversity within religions and that religion can change over time and it can be, in that sense, flexible as people who believe in the religion, who are followers of the religion, try and apply it to the unique time and place in which they live. We will also see some of the achievements of Islamic civilizations, but also try and understand why, despite those achievements, Islamic civilizations did not experience the scientific revolution that Western European countries will have, despite their wealth and power. So just like East Asia, if you're in the year 1500 or so, the Islamic empires are ahead of the West. So we've got this basic question, why is it the West pulls ahead? Now, we need to give you some background information about Islam, things that we talked about in History 121. So first of all, just to get some vocabulary down, Islam is the religion. A Muslim is the follower of the religion. Islam literally means to submit. It means to submit to God's will. Muslim means one who submits. And this is just important because, people who follow Jesus Christ, we call Christians. People who follow the Buddha, we call Buddhists. But in Islam, we use different terminology for a very good reason, because it's the terminology that Muslims themselves use. Now, the the central figure in Islam is the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims believe he was a prophet, that he received special revelations from God that would be written down in the Quran. But what's important about Muhammad was he wasn't just a religious leader. He was a political leader. He governed territory. And he was a military leader. Right? His religious movement was able to survive in a sense because he was a very good military leader and was able to defeat the people who were in opposition to Islam. So what happens is when he dies, that creates a major crisis in the Islamic community because he was not simply a religious leader. I mean, they could have said, well, it's unfortunate Muhammad has died, but he's left us the Quran, so we can kind of just continue. No, he was also a political and military leader. So it left a major hole in the community, and someone needed to kind of step in and fill that vacuum of power, and that person was the Caliph. A Caliph simply means successor, but used in this context, it means successor to Muhammad. So basically, the Caliphs are going to be the political and military successors to Muhammad. It's complex. Some Muslims believe that they should also be a religious successor, others don't. But in any case, it's understood that after the death of Muhammad, that there will be a successor of Muhammad who will lead the one single unified Islamic community. Right? They're not supposed to be divided into multiple communities. There's only one Islam. All Muslims should be united under one community, first led by Muhammad, but then by his successor, the Caliph. The problem is that there was, even though they're supposed to be unified, there was a division over who should be the first caliph and how the caliph should be chosen. I spent a lot of time in this in History 121. We don't really have the time to spend here, but there's two major branches of Islam. Sunni Muslims, the majority group, argued that the caliph should be chosen by the community, and they had their own person they thought should be caliph, Abu Bakr, and he became caliph. The people who would become known as Shia Muslims believed that the caliph had to be like a descendant of Muhammad. Right? It wasn't just enough for the community to say, oh, this person is the successor of Muhammad. It had to be someone who was a descendant. And they wanted Ali, who was Muhammad's son-in-law. because legally as the son-in-law he would be a descendant, even though he's a son-in-law rather than a son. He would have counted. So Shia Muslims believe that he should have been the first caliph. So I just want to stress there's this idea that there's supposed to be one unified Islam led by the Caliph. However, there was a dispute among people who would come to be known as the Sunni and Shia over how the Caliph should be chosen. So you're going to have this divided community, and there would actually be wars fought over who should be Caliph. Now, eventually what happens is, despite this division, the Caliphate is able to unify. Right? Despite the fact that there's this division, eventually the Islamic community is able to largely settle this issue. Not completely, not forever, not perfectly, but they're able to solidify it enough to get enough unity that they're able to expand. And this caliphate will reach out of the Middle East into North Africa and even come to include Spain. And for hundreds of years, you're going to have this rule by these caliphs, by the successors to Muhammad, and the Islamic world will largely be unified. Now that's kind of background information. What's going to happen for our time period? The caliphate has been, in a sense, divided. The Islamic world, the caliphate has been divided, the Islamic world has been divided. You're not going to have a single solitary caliph who rules the vast majority of the Muslim world. Instead, you're going to have 3 Islamic empires. The first is the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire is centered on the modern-day nation-state of Turkey, right? Modern-day nation-state of Turkey. And you can kind of see in the early caliphate, right? This is the caliphate in the 9th century, before these empires have been formed. You don't even see Turkey as part of the Islamic world. It was part of something called Byzantium, which we'll talk about later. But you've got the Ottoman, the Turks, the people here will eventually convert mostly to Islam, and we'll have an Ottoman Empire focused in this area in Turkey. The next empire, the 3 that we'll look at that come about after the division of the Caliphate, is the Safavid Empire, which is centered in modern-day Iran. And I want to stress the people living in Turkey and Iran still have a very strong identity remembering this history. Right, so Turkish people today are very proud of the developments, of the accomplishments of the Ottoman Empire. Similarly, the Persian people living in Iran, Iranians, think highly of the Safavid Empire. The third empire that we'll look at is Mughal Empire, the Mughal Empire, which, similar to Turkey, was not part of the original caliphate because it's centered in India. Right, so there's the Mughal Empire centered in India. But whereas at one time you had this single unified Islamic world under the Caliph, it wasn't completely unified, but it had a lot of unity. By our time period, by the 1600s, it has been divided, right? And there's multiple Islamic empires. The Ottoman Empire centered on modern-day Turkey, the Safavid Empire centered on modern-day Iran, and the Mughal Empire centered on modern-day India. And all of them had different understandings of Islam, right? All of them are going to have different understandings of Islam based on the historical circumstances in which they exist. Right? So this is something very important we want to keep in mind. I'm trying to show you the diversity of Islam, that we can't just say Islam is this or Islam is that. Islam is many things depending on the time, the place, the people. Now, we need to also talk about Byzantium. I mentioned previously that this area of modern-day Turkey, you could see in that map of the Caliphate, that was not controlled by the Caliphate, right? It was controlled by something called Byzantium. Byzantium is fascinating. Historians often like to talk about it because it's so interesting. But sometimes we talk about how the Roman Empire fell in the 5th century. That's true for the Western Roman Empire, the one that was centered around the city of Rome. But the Eastern Roman Empire, centered around the city of Constantinople, would actually stand until the 15th century. And we call that Eastern Roman Empire, that stands until the 15th century, 1,000 years after the traditional date, 5th century date given for the fall of the Western Roman Empire. We call that empire Byzantium. It was Greek speaking. Even though they found themselves as the Romans, they didn't really speak Latin. They spoke Greek. It was a Christian empire as well. And they had a very, very strong Christian identity. And you can see that this is the flag with the symbol of the Byzantine Empire. You've got this double-headed eagle with a sword showing that it was a government that wielded violence. But also you've got the crown showing an empire marked with a cross. And you've got an orb also with a cross showing a belief in the eventual triumph of Christianity. Right. So this is the group that when Islam will expand in places like Turkey, it's going to be expanding against them and will eventually lead to the destruction. And that's why I call it a doomed empire. And just to give you a sense of where we're at on the map, right, you can see this is kind of the heartland of the Byzantine Empire here. This area is now modern-day Turkey, will become the center of the Ottoman Empire. And there's, like I said, the Western Roman Empire was centered on Rome. It fell in the 5th century, but this Byzantine Empire, centered on the city of Constantinople, will not fall till the 15th century, and that's something we'll talk about later. But hopefully that's giving you a good introduction of the 3 Islamic empires we'll be looking at, some background on the history of Islam, and one of the empire, the Christian empire, the Ottoman Empire, will be expanding against.